It's actually 5%, made up of the following: 3.5% of GDP to go towards defense, military purchases and training, that type of thing. And then 1.5% should go towards infrastructure, military infrastructure, which tackles the problem that we have in Europe with what's called military mobilization.
Jim Townsend, thank you so much for speaking to us. We've heard reports in British media today about a 3.5% target that NATO is going to try to get members to agree to at a summit later this month. This is a new target across the whole of NATO, is that right?
Well, that's right, and it's actually 5%, made up of the following: 3.5% of GDP to go towards defense, military purchases and training, that type of thing. And then 1.5% should go towards infrastructure, military infrastructure, which tackles the problem that we have in Europe with what's called military mobilization or military mobility, which is how the militaries can move across Europe. So the German railway system, bridges going into Poland, railroad track compatibility between the West and East Europe. I mean, there's a lot of things that have to be fixed, and they have not been fixed yet.
3.5% of that then is what we're talking: hardware, personnel, and so on. And then the other 1.5% is on, as you say, the logistics and the things we wouldn't traditionally think of as defense infrastructure, but as you've explained there, have a real impact.
And that helps us get to the 5%, which is what Donald Trump was urging on the allies. So it was a way to get to 5% in a way that's probably a little more achievable than saying, okay, we're going to go from 2% to 5% all on military purchases.
So let's focus on the hardware side of it, that the 3.5, and we'll leave that 1.5% to get to the 5 aside for a second. I've been going through the stats for the UK. That's about a £28.5 billion increase from where the government's aiming to be in a couple of years, which in US terms is sort of $38.5 billion. What does that actually get you? Try to explain to our listeners who might not be military experts. We talk in these percentage terms. What in hard terms are we getting for our money, for example?
Well, that's a great, great question. And it's one that all taxpayers should ask, and particularly for Times Radio and others who deliver that news. I'm really glad you're asking that question. And it's kind of hard to describe, but I'll jump into it. The first thing is, UK is going through an SDR, or the Strategic Defense Review. And that is a bit of a roadmap for the UK, which says we need to be putting more money into these areas, buying more attack submarines, for instance, that kind of thing. And so more money for housing for military families, more money for munitions factories in the UK. So based on the threat as the MOD and the services see in the UK, and that was, of course, given to those that were doing the review. Lord Robertson, of course, heading that up. The thinking had to be: so how do we meet this threat on what we have already? The planes, the tanks, the people. How do we meet that threat into the future, and what more will we need? And so what they did was they went around and they talked to the Pentagon. I talked to them. A lot of people talked to that review group, giving their ideas. Also, it was shaped by what was happening in Ukraine. What we're seeing in Ukraine is a revolution in military affairs, how war is being fought. We saw that a few days ago when Ukraine launched that massive drone attack against those strategic bases, air bases that the Russians have. That was their Pearl Harbor. And so they're all the Western allies, including UK, woke up the next morning and said, "Oh my God, are we vulnerable to that too?" So when you're doing a strategic defense review, you're having to take into account the problems you have today versus what you think you're going to need tomorrow. And that can translate into, as I said, more submarines. It could translate into more aircraft with different kinds of missions. It could translate into more people. It could translate into more exercises. And this happens over time. When this money comes in to the MOD and to the services, they already have plans laid out on where it needs to go. They've told the parliament about that. This is not something that is new. The public knows about it too. And so, as this money becomes available over time in the years ahead, this is used to buy hardware and training and people to do what's needed.
You've mentioned there that's the sort of long-term planning. This NATO target, I believe, is for 2035. By then, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin will be in their 80s. We could, in a thought experiment, we'd be towards the end of a second term of J.D. Vance's presidency. We'd be looking for who's succeeding him. This feels an awfully long way off. Is it too far off?
Well, again, it goes back to the threat. And if you talk to a lot of the intel people in the alliance, they'll say that they believe Russia will be ready to do some mischievous things, if you will, maybe Estonia, maybe Moldova, who knows? But he'll be ready to do that if Ukraine is out of the way in the next 5 years, next 7 years, next 10 years. So if we're looking at something in the latter part of the 2030s, that's a bit far off. So actually, we are behind the eight ball, as we say in the U.S. We are behind. We're running behind in terms of where we should have been. And part of that is because we took a vacation after 1990, 1991, the end of the Cold War, and everybody was cutting budgets, including the U.S. But we realized, and as the decades went on, that Russia wasn't turning into the country we thought it was going to be. And suddenly they became a threat. And now we're racing, NATO is racing, to try to catch up and make ourselves strong enough to deter him. So the question becomes, with this budget being spent, the things being bought, the timeline, will we have enough purchased and enough training done, enough ammunition stocked up to deter him from doing something against an ally like Estonia? It depends on Putin's perceptions. If he perceives that we don't, because we haven't been spending the money, he reads the SDR that the UK is doing as well. And if he sees things on there that aren't really applicable or irrelevant to what he wants to do, that emboldens him to do something. Because this is his time. He sees a Europe that isn't spending. He sees NATO telling allies, "You've got to do more," and he knows the time lag between getting that money from the Parliament and actually getting deliveries of the equipment. And it could be 5 years, 6 years before that even arrives into the military establishments in the UK. So it's a race against time in a lot of ways.
And if, as you say, we're behind the curve, you're not the first expert on this podcast, or indeed any analysis I've heard, to warn of potential Russian action in, say, the Baltic states. How quickly can this sort of defence spending be ramped up? If we're aiming for 2035, but actually, as you say, within the next 5 years, we're into an even more serious, a further escalated conflict with Russia, how quickly can NATO members pour money in an effective way and actually get some bang for their buck?
Well, that is a great question, because I'm afraid that's a lot of the root of the problem, is that in both the United States and in Europe, we allowed our defense industry to get smaller. It atrophied from where it was in the Cold War, when they were pretty big and could churn out things pretty quickly. Right now, they're pretty small. And industry responds to demand signals from countries, from governments that want to buy things. Now suddenly they're going from 0 to 60 in terms of demand, and they don't have the plant and the equipment and the workers, specialized workers, particularly in the U.S., to produce at the scale that the demand is. So if that were to ramp up, and we realized we needed to really get better in 5 years, not 15. Um, the delivery times would be well into the future because the assembly lines, they're not there. They'd have to build them in a lot of cases. They'd have to build new factories in order to produce, and it takes time to do that. So you're seeing now in Germany, Rheinmetall is getting an old factory. I think they produce Volkswagens or something, and they're converting that to produce tanks. You're seeing that kind of thing happening in the U.S. as well. I've heard the SDR has some of those ideas in terms of munitions plants for the UK. So we're starting from scratch in some areas. And unlike World War II, where we were able to produce a lot of Spitfires coming off the assembly line pretty fast, those are basic planes compared to what we have today. An F-35 or a Jaguar or whatever can take a lot longer to get off an assembly line because it's the precision both of its manufacture and the munitions it carries. It takes a long time. It's not like a B-17 bomber of World War II fame. They produce one every hour. That doesn't happen. So it goes back to Putin's perceptions. Does he see that too? And does he see that his window will be slammed shut in 10 years? Because by then the West will have caught up. Uh, but so he says, I've got a window that's 5 years, and Donald Trump will be in office, who's friendly towards Putin. So if Putin looks at the world scene, and China particularly, what China may do in terms of Taiwan, and China's looking at what Russia might do in terms of, say, Estonia. So there is this stew of things, geopolitical things, defense industrial things that are at play here as the SDR is put together, because they have to think about that too. And so if you're at NATO, and when I was there as a planner, we had to think about these things. If we found ourselves in that situation, we would have to prioritize on those things that we think are top of the deterrence ladder. But we would also have to understand that that kind of slack in the conventional capability to deter means that you might have to depend more on nuclear weapons than you thought you would have to in the past.
This is a tricky question because I understand that it will vary from country to country and circumstance to circumstance. But say this 3.5% target on hardware plus the extra to get to 5% on general infrastructure. Is this a plan for NATO to appear and send a warning message to Putin that, we are really strong and we've got the funding behind this and that our deterrent is strong enough? Or is this the bare minimum that frankly NATO needs to be doing? I mean, what is a percentage that countries need to be war ready, I suppose, is my question.
Well, like you said, it's hard to give a general answer because it's different for every country. But it's an important question, and what I would say is that we need certainly more than 3.5% to be spent by nations. But like we were just talking about, we could throw a lot of money at the problem, and if industry can't crank out what we need, then what good does it do? Um, so I would say in general, 3.5% is not necessarily the bare minimum, but the minimum. It's definitely a floor. And so uh, you know, but even that 3.5% is going to be hard for a lot of nations to meet. We've been listening to the debates, and with the SDR coming out and the talk by part of the UK political scene that's a damp squib, that's there's no money towards it, and of course. Keir Starmer is having to say, well, we're going to put money towards it and put some real credibility behind that, because that's always been an issue, is where does the money come from? And it's not just the UK, but everywhere, including in the United States. So again, it goes back to Putin and his perception of NATO and the allies. He'll be watching that summit. He'll be watching if the summit, in fact, agrees to 3.5 plus 1.5. And I think that's already been established. But he'll be looking at that. He will try to gauge, how credible really is it that nations are going to do that. And I think it's important to say that he won't be watching every nation. There's some nations that he probably doesn't care so much if they spend 3.5, but he cares about the UK. He cares about where the UK is going, because the UK leads a lot of the alliance in terms of how much they're going to spend. They always look at the UK and say, well, if the UK is doing it, we'll do it. But if they're not, we're not. Same thing with France. Same thing with Germany. Those three countries is who he watches. And we know he has a certain animus towards the UK. Putin is got it in for the UK for whatever reason. So When the SDR was being written, that fact had to be incorporated too. What are the kinds of things that Putin will single out just for the UK? We're not talking about a big invasion or this or that, but this hybrid war that's out there. And so, in reading the SDR, I saw there are some things that UK will be doing to try to address those kinds of threats coming from Moscow.
Just a couple more questions, Jim, and I'll let you get on with your
Go
day.
as long as you want.
Uh, it's interesting that there you mentioned, say, that the UK has been seen, certainly by the likes of Russia, I think by the UK itself, as one of the key players within NATO, sort of the structure being the US is obviously this monolith that keeps it going. Then you've got among the European allies, say Britain and France, Germany as other key players because of their size of their economies, and in Britain and France's case, a nuclear deterrent. How much do you see that balance shifting so that actually Eastern European countries are becoming much more important players because of their more long-standing, sort of higher spending, a higher percentage of GDP spending on defence, compared to the traditional big players within NATO?
Well, I think the case of Poland is instructive in the sense that the Poles, uh, based on their history with Russia, their geographic location with Russia, their experience of the last century with Germany and Russia, they now that they're out from under the Warsaw Pact, if you will, they have, and particularly since 2014, they've put a lot of money into defense. They're already, I think, at 5% of GDP just on defense spending on military equipment. And of course, they can't find industry to deliver as quickly as they want it to be delivered. So they're buying from Korea. They're buying from other places that can deliver stuff more quickly than, say, the U.S. or other places could deliver. So they're very serious about this. And because of that, they probably have the largest military on the continent of Europe. And we'll throw the UK into that too. They've got a very large army, which in and of itself is only good up to a point. But I mean, but the point here is that their military establishment, air and air defense and land forces are tremendous, and they're exercising all the time, and they're very aware of that threat across the border. The three Balts are as well, but they're very small. Their defense and they're spending, I think, close to 5%, certainly up there, which will buy them some. But NATO has forces in there to supplement their national forces. They're just too small to do it by themselves. And so so Poland particularly is really kind of leading the pack. Germany has just broken out. They have gotten rid of their debt brake when it comes to defense spending. They are doing a lot, and they do have a defense industry that we all are familiar with. That's quite credible. And it's cranking. It is really now cranking in, not just for German defense, but for Ukraine too. I know the French and I know the UK, BAE Systems. Y'all are beginning to do the same thing. But like we said earlier on, if we had done this 10 years ago, it would have been better. But we're doing it now, and we're racing on. In the U.S., we're having trouble with shipbuilding. There's not enough yards, there's not enough workers to make that go. Where our spending is it's off the charts now, and we've got the Indo-Pacific to worry about. So, but back to your question, I think Poland is really going to become the engine in a lot of ways. Although once Germany gets cranking, it'll be a horse race. And I hope with Keir Starmer and with Macron in France that those two. I mean, the thing is, not every nation has a defense industry and a history the way the UK and France do. That really plays a lot in terms of how well you can use the money. Your original question. In those countries, given the industry there and the history there, there's a better shot at using new spending in a way that's going to be helpful and efficient. But it calls for a lot of eyes watching it. But I think that's something that UK and France are used to doing. So we'll see what's happening. See if they can catch Poland.
Let's return to the 1.5%, which you've brought up and I feel has been underreported possibly in UK media. So often when we've had military planners, military specialists come on. They talk about the challenge that NATO has, where Russia is one monolithic military power. Its systems are all linear, and you're dealing with one system with Russia. With NATO, however much military power you have, you are dealing with dozens of different types of tanks or different road systems, as you described. Just talk us through, from a planner's perspective, what are the challenges at the moment with how NATO would mobilise practically, and how this 1.5% would improve that?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. And I would say a couple things. First is in terms of how that money would be used, I'm thinking of bridges. During the Cold War days in Western Europe, all the bridges could handle a tank. It took decades to get there, but after a while, that was happened. The runways could handle big aircraft. The rail network could handle military rail and have special offload platforms where you could offload a tank from a flatbed railroad car to something that could bear the weight, so they could drive the tank off the ramp. And so there was these things that were built, pipelines, and all these things. Well, when the Cold War ended and we brought in these new allies, we didn't do that. It hadn't been done during the Cold War, obviously. And then here we were in an area in a time when Russia wasn't the threat. And so we didn't put money into Polish bridges or Estonian rail lines or the German rail system that expanded, and it didn't keep the military in mind, but it expanded and grew for the commercial traffic. And then all of a sudden, boom, things change, and we understand that the front line is no longer the inner German border. It's now further north, and we got to move forces from bases in Germany up into Poland or into the Baltics. And so uh, in 2014, there was a famous Dragoon ride done by General Ben Hodges, who was the head of the U.S. Army then. He got together a group of armored vehicles and said, okay, I want you to drive to Slovakia from Germany. Drive to Slovakia. See how well it goes. And it was terrible because not only did the roads couldn't carry that kind of weight, but the border posts, they couldn't cross the border because they were military vehicles with live ammunition, and you had to have paperwork, and the drivers had to have a passport, and so you don't think about this, but when you move a body of troops, you don't want to be stopped at every border and inspected for drugs or something, and so this money is going to go to roads, it's going to go to bridges, it's going to go back and look at that German railway system to look at how if they can find areas where you can offload a tank and not have it collapse. They're going to have to look at ports in the three Baltic countries to make sure there's some ports that can handle ammunition ships that might come in there. Antwerp, the same thing, because time has moved on since the Cold War days. And so there's a lot of catch up in terms of infrastructure that you've got to have in place to move militaries across the continent quickly. And they've been working on that since the famous Dragoon ride in 2014, and it is very slow. I think the paperwork pretty much has been done in terms of crossing borders, but there's the physical aspects, and that's where this money, the 1.5%, will come into use, is to fix these problems so you can move a tank very quickly from Germany to Latvia.
It's fascinating. It's the practicalities you don't think of. Jim Townsend, thank you so much for speaking to us.
You're welcome.